I used to sleepwalk a lot when I was a kid. Like a lot. We lived in Decatur, Georgia, which wasn't exactly the safest place to grow up. Our neighborhood was rough, constant police sirens, sketchy people hanging around, the works. My sleepwalking made things even scarier because I'd wake up in the most random places. I can't count how many times I found myself outside in the middle of the night, barefoot on the cold pavement, completely clueless about how I got there. Usually I'd wake up, look around, and book it back home as fast as I could. Of course, that meant walking through the open front door I'd left wide open, perfect for anyone lurking around. My mom used to scold me about it, but what could she really do? It wasn't like I was doing it on purpose. But one night was different, and it's haunted me ever since. I was 9 years old. I went to bed like any other night, probably wearing my favorite Batman pajamas because I was obsessed with them. I don't remember much of the dream I was having, but I do remember waking up. Not in the middle of the street, not on the porch, but in my bedroom, standing at the window. The curtains were pulled back, and I was just standing there, staring out into the darkness. That was weird enough because usually I'd snap out of my sleepwalking trance outside. But this time, I was already awake, already aware of myself, and that's when I saw him. There was a man outside my window. He was massive, like freakishly tall and broad-shouldered. The guy was completely hairless, not a strand on his head, no eyebrows, no beard. Nothing. His skin looked pale, almost sickly under the faint glow of the streetlight, and he was staring right at me. No, through me. His eyes were wide, and his expression was almost confused, like he couldn't figure out what he was looking at. I froze. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. At first, I thought I might still be dreaming, but everything felt so real. The way the cold window glass pressed against my palms, the distant hum of a passing car, the sound of my own shaky breaths. I was awake. This was happening. The man started moving closer to the window. He wasn't walking, though. It was more like a slow, deliberate shuffle. His head tilted slightly, as if he were trying to get a better look at me. With every inch he moved, my terror grew. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen in place, my feet rooted to the floor. And then, as his face came closer to the glass, something in me snapped. I opened my mouth and screamed. Not just any scream, a raw, animalistic wail that tore through the silence of the night. At the same time, I felt a warm, wet sensation trickling down my leg. Yeah, I peed myself. I'm not proud of it, but you try staring down a creepy, hairless giant in the middle of the night and see how composed you are. The man's reaction was bizarre. He flinched like I'd just smacked him across the face, and then he screamed too. His scream wasn't like mine, though. It was high-pitched and shrill, almost like a wounded animal. He stumbled backward, tripped over something, and fell in the grass. But instead of getting up and running away like a normal person, he did this weird tumbling move, like a somersault, and then bolted off in a zigzag pattern. I swear, it looked like he was trying to dodge invisible bullets or something. By the time he disappeared into the darkness, my mom had burst into my room. She was half asleep and frazzled, asking me what the hell was going on. I was crying and shaking so hard I could barely get the words out. I told her there was a man at my window, that he was staring at me, and that he ran away when I screamed. Of course, she didn't believe me. She said I must have had a nightmare and told me to go back to bed. I begged her to check the window, the yard, anything, but she brushed it off and said I needed to calm down. Eventually, she tucked me back into bed and sat with me until I fell asleep, though I don't think I slept much after that. The next morning, things got even weirder. When we went outside to grab the paper, we found a screwdriver lying on the front porch. It wasn't ours, just a random, rusty old screwdriver sitting there like it had been dropped in a hurry. There were also scratches on the door jamb and damage to the handle, like someone had been trying to force their way in. My mom still tried to play it off, saying it was probably just some neighborhood kids messing around. But I knew better. That man wasn't some random burglar. He wasn't a drunk or a junkie looking for an easy score. There was something off about him, something that didn't feel human. And the way he screamed, the way he moved, it still sends shivers down my spine. After that night, I stopped sleepwalking. I don't know if it was the sheer terror that cured me or if something else changed, but I never woke up outside or at the window again. My mom eventually installed new locks on the doors and even put bars on the windows, though she still insisted it was just a coincidence. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that whatever, or whoever, that man was, he wasn't just passing through. He was looking for something. Maybe he found it, maybe he didn't. Either way, I hope to God I never see him again. I'll never forget the day the earth opened up and tried to swallow us whole. It was July 16th, 1990, a day that will forever be burned into my memory. I was just a kid back then, living in the Philippines, with no idea how quickly life could go from normal to terrifying in just a few moments. The morning had been completely ordinary. School had let out early that day, and I was excited to get home and watch my favorite cartoon. My dad had picked me up, and we were walking through town together. The sun was blazing, the streets were noisy with jeepneys honking, vendors calling out their wares, and children running around like they didn't have a care in the world. It felt like every other day in our busy little town, until it wasn't. It started as a low rumble beneath my feet, almost like the growl of a faraway thunderstorm. At first, I didn't think much of it. Earthquakes weren't unheard of in the Philippines, but they were usually small, a quick jolt that made you stop what you were doing for a second before everything went back to normal. But this wasn't like that. This rumble didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder, angrier, until the ground beneath us started to sway. People screamed. The air filled with the sound of shattering glass, crashing metal, and collapsing concrete. Buildings groaned as if alive, trembling against the strain before giving way and crumbling into heaps of rubble. It was chaos. People ran in every direction, shouting prayers and screaming for loved ones. My dad grabbed my hand so tightly it hurt, but I didn't care. I was too scared to let go. "Stay close to me," he shouted over the noise, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. I clung to him as the earth bucked and shook, sending us stumbling like we were trying to walk on the deck of a sinking ship. The street we'd been walking down minutes earlier was now an obstacle course of broken pavement, fallen power lines, and debris. I could feel the heat of fires starting to spread, could hear the panicked wails of people trapped under rubble. It felt like it lasted forever, but in reality, the main quake was over in less than a minute. When the shaking finally stopped, the silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't really silent, of course. There were still cries for help, the crackle of flames, the occasional creak of a building on the verge of collapse. But it felt quiet compared to the chaos of moments before. I looked around, my legs trembling so badly I thought they might give out. The street I had walked 100 times before was unrecognizable. Where there had been shops and houses, there were now piles of concrete and twisted metal. People were crawling out of the wreckage, their faces streaked with blood and dust, their eyes wide with shock. "Come on," my dad said, his voice firm. He didn't let go of my hand as he led me through the wreckage, carefully navigating the cracked pavement and broken glass. As we walked, I started to notice something strange. Lined up along the sides of the road were rows of large, brightly colored bags. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. They almost looked like bundles of clothes or supplies, hastily gathered in the aftermath of the disaster. But something about the way people avoided looking at them made me uneasy. "Dad, what's in the bags?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Don't look," he said quickly, pulling me closer to his side. "But, just don't look, okay?" he snapped, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard before. I didn't ask again, but I couldn't stop my eyes from drifting toward the bags as we passed. Some of them were partially open, revealing glimpses of what was inside. My stomach churned as realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't bags of clothes or supplies. They were bodies. The brightly colored tarps and plastic sheets had been used to wrap the dead, row after row of them laid out along the street like some kind of grim inventory. Some were small, too small, children, I realized with a sickening jolt. The smell was awful, a nauseating mix of blood, smoke, and decay that made me gag. My dad must have noticed because he stopped and crouched down in front of me, blocking my view with his body. His hands were firm on my shoulders as he looked me in the eye. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and serious. "We're gonna get home, okay? But you have to stay focused. Don't look at anything, don't ask questions. Just keep your eyes on me and keep walking. Can you do that?" I nodded, too scared to argue. The walk home felt like it lasted a lifetime. Everywhere we went, there were more bodies, more destruction. People wandered the streets like ghosts, their faces blank with shock. A woman clutched a bundle of clothes that I realized was a baby, her wails piercing the heavy air. A man sat on the curb, staring at nothing, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. By the time we reached our house, I was too numb to feel relief. The front wall had partially caved in, but it was still standing, which was more than I could say for a lot of the buildings around us. My mom was outside, tears streaming down her face as she ran to hug us. That night, we slept outside on the ground, too scared to go back inside. The aftershocks came in waves, each one bringing fresh panic as we waited to see if the world would fall apart again. I didn't sleep much that night, or for many nights after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the rows of bodies, the blank stares of the people in the streets, the destruction that had turned my town into a graveyard. It's been years since that day, but I can still see it all so clearly. The earthquake changed everything. I've always thought of myself as a good person. You know, the kind of kid who follows the rules, helps old ladies cross the street, and doesn't think twice about doing the right thing. But sometimes doing the right thing can go horribly wrong. That's what I learned one hot summer day when I was 12, and it's a lesson that's stuck with me ever since. It started like any other day in my small suburban neighborhood. The sun was blazing, the air was thick and humid, and I was hanging out on the sidewalk near our favorite corner store. I was waiting for my dad, who'd just run in to grab a soda. The street was busy but familiar. Parents walking their kids, teens on bikes, the usual neighborhood vibe. Nothing out of the ordinary. That's when I saw him. He was a massive man, at least 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms so thick they looked like tree trunks. His clothes hung off him like he didn't care much about how he looked. A stained gray t-shirt and baggy jeans that were too short for his long legs. He walked with an awkward, lumbering gait, his head slightly bowed. I didn't think much of him at first. He looked like just another guy wandering the neighborhood. But then I noticed something. A dollar bill fell from his pocket as he walked past me. It fluttered to the ground, catching the sunlight as it landed near the edge of the road. He didn't even notice. My first instinct was to help. I mean, how hard could it be? Just pick it up and hand it back, right? So I did. I darted into the street, scooped up the crumpled dollar, and jogged over to him. "Excuse me, sir. You dropped this," I said, holding the bill out to him. He stopped abruptly and turned to face me. Up close, he was even bigger than I'd realized. His shadow loomed over me, and I suddenly felt very, very small. I was a scrawny 12-year-old girl, barely 100 pounds soaking wet, and this guy towered over me like a mountain. But what struck me most wasn't his size, it was his face. There was something off about him. His eyes didn't quite focus on me. They darted around like he was looking for something, or someone else. His mouth hung open slightly, and when he spoke, his words were slow and slurred, like he was struggling to put them together. "Thank you," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. He took the dollar bill and stared at it like it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. Then he looked back at me, his eyes narrowing. "You're a nice kid," he muttered, almost to himself. "A nice kid? Yeah, no problem," I said, already starting to back away. Something about the way he was staring at me made my skin crawl. But before I could take another step, his hand shot out. It happened so fast. 1 second, I was standing there awkwardly, and the next, his massive hand was on top of my head. His fingers tangled in my hair, gripping me like a vice. "Wait," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. "Don't go." Panic flooded my body. I tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. I couldn't move. His hand pressed down harder, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes, not from pain, but from sheer terror. I was trapped. "Let me go," I shouted, my voice cracking. I twisted and squirmed, but it was no use. He was too strong. His other hand started to move toward me, and my mind raced with every terrible possibility. Was he going to drag me somewhere? Hurt me? I couldn't think straight. All I knew was that I needed to get away now. And then, like a miracle, I heard a familiar voice. "Hey, get your hands off her." It was my dad. He was running toward us, his face red with fury. My dad isn't a big guy, definitely nowhere near the size of this man. But at that moment, he looked like he could take on a grizzly bear. The man hesitated, his grip loosening just enough for me to pull free. My dad grabbed my arm and pulled me behind him, putting himself between me and the man. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" my dad barked, his voice steady and commanding. The man stared at us, his expression blank. For a moment, I thought he might lunge at my dad, but then his face softened. He mumbled something under his breath, something I couldn't make out, and started to shuffle away, his head hanging low. "Keep walking," my dad growled, watching him until he disappeared around the corner. When he was gone, my dad turned to me, his hands gripping my shoulders. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" I shook my head, still too shaken to speak. My whole body was trembling, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We didn't stick around after that. My dad walked me home, his arm around me the whole way, and I didn't let go of him once. When we got there, he called the police and reported what had happened, but they said there wasn't much they could do. The man hadn't technically done anything illegal, they said, though they promised to keep an eye out for him. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those unfocused eyes, that strange, vacant expression, and felt his hand on my head, holding me like I was a toy he didn't want to let go of. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. If my dad hadn't been there, if he'd been even a minute later coming out of the store, I don't want to think about what might have happened. I don't pick up lost dollar bills anymore. At 27, the idea of an empty house still sends a chill down my spine. People think it's weird, but they don't know the story. They don't know what happened when I was 11 years old, when I faced the most terrifying night of my life. It started like any other evening. My mom had to work late, so I was left home alone. I'd done it a few times before, nothing major, just a couple of hours here and there. I'd always felt a little uneasy about it, but I figured it was part of growing up. This time was no different. I made myself some mac and cheese, watched a little TV, and tried not to think about how quiet the house felt without anyone else in it. By the time I got ready for bed, I was feeling okay. I locked the front door, double-checked the back door, and even flipped the porch light on, like my mom had taught me. Then I crawled under my blankets and turned on the little lamp by my bed. I told myself I'd stay up and read, but the day must have worn me out because I drifted off pretty quickly. I woke up to the sound of banging. At first, I thought I was dreaming. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I just lay there frozen listening. Then it came again, loud, deliberate thuds, like someone was hitting the front door with their fists. My heart started to pound. I sat up in bed, clutching my blanket, and strained to hear anything else. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold, the rattle of the doorknob. Someone was trying to get in. I didn't think. I just reacted. I threw off my blankets, grabbed the cordless phone from my nightstand, and bolted out of the room. My bare feet slapped against the floor as I ran to the kitchen, my mind racing. Don't scream. Don't cry. Call 911. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone, but I managed to punch in the numbers. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own breathing. There's someone at my door, I whispered, crouching down behind the pantry door. They're trying to get in. Stay on the line, she said. Where are you in the house? I'm in the pantry, I told her. I'm hiding. Good. Stay where you are. Keep the door closed and stay quiet. Officers are on their way. As she spoke, the banging grew louder. I pressed myself deeper into the pantry, sliding onto the bottom shelf and curling into the smallest ball I could manage. My knees were pressed to my chest, the phone clutched tightly in my hands. I felt like my heart might explode, and then the noise stopped. For a brief, agonizing moment, I thought they might have given up. Maybe they'd realized the door was locked and decided to move on. But then I heard something worse, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving along the side of the house. They were heading for the side door. I bit my lip to keep from crying out as the handle on the pantry door jiggled, then went still. The steps moved again, this time toward the glass door in the living room. I could hear their breath faintly through the thin wood, labored and rough. They tried the handle there too. The dispatcher kept whispering into my ear, telling me to stay calm, telling me the police were close. But every second felt like an hour. Then, all at once, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the window, illuminating the dark pantry in bursts of color. The footsteps retreated quickly, heavy and panicked, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe again. I stayed where I was, trembling and clutching the phone, until I heard voices outside. This is the police. Is anyone inside? I opened my mouth to answer, but no sound came out. My voice was stuck somewhere deep in my throat. The footsteps drew closer, this time steady and purposeful, and then the pantry door opened. A uniformed officer knelt in front of me. He couldn't have been more than 30, with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. Hey there, he said softly. You're safe now. Can I pick you up? I nodded, tears streaming down my face. He reached out, and I threw my arms around his neck, clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in the world. He carried me out of the house, his voice calm and steady, telling me everything was going to be okay. Outside, the flashing lights from the squad cars lit up the night, and a few neighbors stood on their porches, watching the scene unfold. But I didn't care about any of that. All I cared about was holding on to that officer until my mom got there. She arrived a few minutes later, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling as she hugged me. I wouldn't let go of the officer until she promised she wouldn't leave me again. He stayed with us until I finally loosened my grip, and even then, he made sure I was calm before he left. I'll never forget the way he looked at me, like I was the most important person in the world in that moment. It made me feel safe, even after everything. I didn't sleep at all that night. I don't think my mom did either. She sat with me on the couch, holding me tightly, while the officers outside searched the area for the person who had tried to break in. They never found him. The sound of the door bursting open was like a gunshot, loud enough to shake the walls and send every nerve in my body into overdrive. My heart slammed against my ribs as I realized what was happening. Someone was inside my house. I'll never forget that day, the terror that clawed at my throat, the way my hands trembled so violently I could barely keep hold of my phone. Looking back, I'm thankful my kids weren't home. That's the only small mercy in a moment that still haunts me. It started out as an ordinary afternoon. My kids were staying with their grandparents for the night, and the house was quiet, just me, the hum of the refrigerator, and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I'd been folding laundry, my mind wandering aimlessly, when the first loud knock came at the door. It wasn't a polite knock, but an angry, pounding fist, heavy and relentless. I froze. Something about it felt wrong, like a warning bell in the back of my mind. I didn't answer, hoping whoever it was would just go away. But instead, the pounding grew louder, more insistent, until the door practically shuddered in its frame. Then came the shouting. "Open the goddamn door," a man bellowed, his voice rough and furious. "I know you're in there." My stomach dropped. I knew that voice. It belonged to my now ex-husband's drug dealer. He was a mountain of a man, with anger that spilled out of him like boiling water. I had seen him once before, a fleeting encounter when my ex had owed him money, but I never thought he'd show up here, especially not like this. The realization hit me like a slap. He wasn't going away. Before I could process what to do, there was a deafening crash. The door flew open, slamming against the wall with enough force to leave a dent. He stormed into the house, his face twisted with rage, screaming at the top of his lungs. "Where the hell is he? You think you can hide from me? I'm gonna fuck you all up." My blood ran cold. He thought my ex was here, hiding somewhere in the house. And if he didn't find him, I didn't want to think about what he'd do. I wasn't even sure if he'd care that I wasn't the one he was looking for. I didn't have time to think. My body moved on instinct, propelling me toward the master bedroom. My walk-in closet was the only place I could think of to hide. My hands fumbled as I yanked the door open and slipped inside, closing it behind me as quietly as I could. My breaths were coming too fast, too shallow, and I pressed my hands to my mouth, trying to muffle the sound. The closet was dark, cramped, and filled with the faint scent of my husband's old cologne. I crouched beneath a pile of blankets, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he'd hear it. With trembling hands, I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? A calm, professional voice answered. I choked on the words, lowering my voice to a frantic whisper. "There's a man in my house. He broke in. He's screaming. Please, you have to hurry." "Stay on the line," the dispatcher said. "Where are you right now?" "I'm in the closet," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "He's looking for my ex. I don't know what he'll do if he finds me." The dispatcher kept talking, her voice steady and soothing, but I could barely focus on her words. Every sound from outside the closet made me flinch. The heavy thud of his boots on the floor, the sound of him tearing through rooms, throwing things around in his search. He was shouting, cursing, furious. "You think you can hide from me? Huh, I'll tear this place apart." He got closer. I could hear his breathing now, heavy and labored, like some kind of beast stalking its prey. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to disappear. My hand clamped down on my phone so tightly that my knuckles ached. The doorknob to the bedroom rattled. My stomach dropped. He was in the room now, just on the other side of the closet door. "Come out, you coward," he screamed, his voice raw and filled with rage. I held my breath, my whole body trembling as I heard him approach the closet. The door creaked as he opened it, and I thought for sure it was over. My mind raced with every terrible possibility. Would he hit me? Would he drag me out of the house? He yanked at a few hanging clothes, muttering under his breath. For some reason, maybe he didn't think I'd be smart enough to hide there, he didn't check beneath the blankets. After a few moments that felt like hours, he stormed back out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The dispatcher's voice pulled me back to reality. The police are almost there. Stay where you are. Just then, the sound of sirens filled the air, loud and blaring. The man must have heard them too, because his shouting turned frantic. I heard him curse one last time before he bolted out the front door, the sound of his heavy boots echoing down the driveway. Moments later, I heard the officers' voices outside, shouting for him to stop. There was a commotion, and then silence. It wasn't until a few minutes later that one of the officers found me in the closet. He opened the door carefully, his face softening when he saw me curled up under the blankets. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now." I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably as he helped me to my feet. I clung to him, just like I had as a child when I scraped my knee or got scared during a storm. He didn't rush me, didn't let go until I was ready. The man had been caught just a few streets over, still shouting about my ex as they hauled him away in handcuffs. The officer stayed with me until I felt steady enough to call a friend to come over. I couldn't bring myself to stay alone that night, or any night after that for a long time. I'd parked in the same spot at work for 12 years. Rain or shine, day or night, it was my spot. Everyone knew it. It wasn't officially reserved or anything, but it was an unspoken rule in the plaza. Don't mess with the guy who parks there. The front row was for customers, the employees were supposed to park in the back, but my spot? It was perfect. Close enough to be convenient, but far enough not to attract attention. Then one day, someone had the nerve to take it. It was early, around 4 a.m., the kind of hour where the world feels asleep. I pulled into the lot, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep, only to find a black Cadillac sitting in my space. Its windows were so darkly tinted they might as well have been painted over. My stomach twisted in irritation. This wasn't one of the usual cars I'd see in the lot. It wasn't even a car I recognized from the other shops in the plaza. A newbie? A stray customer? Whoever it was, they were testing my patience. By lunchtime, it was still there. Its glossy black surface baked in the relentless southern sun, the air around it shimmering with heat waves. Something about it just felt off. My dad, a retired Marine turned cop, used to say, "If your gut says something's wrong, it probably is." But I brushed it off. It was just a stupid car in a stupid parking spot. Except it wasn't gone when I clocked out at the end of my shift. And the next day, when I came in at 1 p.m. and worked till 9:30, the damn thing was still there. By then, the irritation had settled into something darker, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just that it was my spot. The car smelled wrong. Literally. It's the South in the middle of summer, and things can get pretty rank under the blazing sun. But this smell was different, sharp, sour, like rotting meat mixed with burnt plastic. Every time I passed it, the stench hit me in the face, and I had to hold my breath. I didn't want to admit it, but I started feeling uneasy, like the car was more than just a misplaced vehicle. On the third day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. My dad's words echoed in my head, "Listen to your gut." So I gave in. I called the non-emergency police number. "Hi, this is going to sound dumb, but there's this car parked in the lot where I work, and it's been here for 3 days. It smells bad, like really bad." The dispatcher didn't seem particularly concerned. I could practically hear her sighing through the phone. "We'll send someone when we can." I felt like an idiot, standing there in the heat, waiting for an officer to show up. It wasn't like I was sure something was wrong. Maybe I was just being petty. Maybe I just hated losing my spot. But the longer I waited, the more that creeping unease dug into me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. An hour later, a patrol car finally pulled up. The officer stepped out, his expression a mix of boredom and annoyance. He looked at the Cadillac, then back at me. "Is this about a parking dispute?" he asked, pulling out a notepad. "No, it's not that," I said, flushing. The car's been here for days, and it smells weird. I don't know. I thought it was worth checking out." He sighed but walked over to the car. He peered into the darkened windows, then pulled out his radio to call in the license plate. What happened next was like something out of a movie. Within minutes, more police cars arrived. The first officer's demeanor changed completely. Suddenly, he was serious, asking for my ID, my manager's contact information, and whether the plaza had security cameras. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling. The officer hesitated, then said, "This car matches the description of a vehicle linked to an Amber Alert." My blood turned to ice. An Amber Alert? My stomach dropped as he continued, explaining that the car was connected to the last sighting of a missing 15-year-old girl. I watched, frozen, as they popped the trunk. The stench hit like a physical blow, and I turned away, gagging. But even with my back to the scene, I couldn't escape the horror. The officers spoke in hushed, tense voices, their faces pale as they pulled back a blanket to reveal the girl's body. She was mutilated, her lifeless form a testament to unimaginable cruelty. I felt like I was going to be sick. Later, I learned more details, though I almost wished I hadn't. The girl had been dating an older guy, controlling, insecure, the type of person who thrives on power over others. She'd tried to break up with him, but he wouldn't let her go. She made the fatal mistake of getting into his car. He'd driven her 3 counties away, tortured her, stuffed her in the trunk, and left her there to die. Then, as if she were trash, he abandoned the car in our lot and walked away. I didn't know her time of death, and that thought still haunts me. Had she already been gone when the car appeared? Or had she spent those agonizing days suffering, alive but beyond help? The guilt was crushing. If I'd called sooner, could she have been saved? Could I have made a difference? A few friends and I were hanging out in this sketchy part of Phoenix, a place where even the streetlights seemed to give up halfway through their job. The air was thick, warm, and heavy, carrying the faint smell of trash and asphalt. We didn't belong there really, but it was the kind of spot where nobody would bother us, a forgotten corner of the city where we could just talk, joke, and waste time. We'd been sitting on the curb, laughing about something stupid, when we first heard it. A low, raspy groan. It was faint, but unmistakable, like someone in pain. We all froze, our laughter dying in our throats. "Did you hear that?" my friend Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We listened, straining our ears, and then we heard it again. This time it was clearer, a soft, tired voice saying, "Help, help me." We exchanged uneasy glances. The smart thing to do would have been to leave right then and there. This wasn't a safe neighborhood, and wandering toward a mysterious groaning voice was just asking for trouble. But curiosity got the better of us. Or maybe it was guilt. What if someone really needed help? "Let's just check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The voice was coming from a narrow alley, dark and cluttered with trash bags and broken furniture. As we stepped closer, the groaning grew louder, more desperate. And then we saw him. A man was lying on the ground, his shirt soaked in blood. The crimson stain spread across his chest like a gruesome flower, and in one hand, he was holding the hilt of a knife buried deep in his gut. His other hand clawed weakly at the ground, as though trying to drag himself forward. His eyes locked onto us the moment we appeared, sharp and unblinking, and his face twisted in a grimace of pain. "Help me," he whimpered, his voice cracking. "Oh God, I'm going to die. Please help me." I froze. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The blood, the knife, the desperate look in his eyes. It was too much. My stomach churned, and for a moment, I thought I might be sick. "We'll call an ambulance," Jake said, already pulling out his phone. But as soon as the words left his mouth, the man's expression changed. Fear flickered across his face, and he shook his head frantically. "No, don't call 911, he said, his voice rising. "Just help me. I'm going to die." His sudden outburst sent a chill down my spine. Why wouldn't he want us to call for help? That was the first thing anyone would do in a situation like this. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I glanced at my friends, and I could see the same doubt mirrored in their faces. "We have to," I said, my voice shaky but firm. "You need help, and we're not doctors." The man groaned again, clutching the knife in his stomach. "Please no," he begged. "Just help me. Don't call them." Jake ignored him and started dialing. The man's eyes snapped toward him, and for a split second, I saw something that made my blood run cold, anger. His pain and desperation were still there, but beneath it, there was something darker, something that didn't belong on the face of a man dying on the ground. Before any of us could react, the man did something none of us expected. He stood up. The movement was sudden and unnatural, like a puppet jerked upright by invisible strings. His blood-soaked shirt clung to his chest, and the knife was still embedded in his stomach, but he was standing now, his posture stiff and unnerving. His eyes darted between us, wide and wild, and his breathing grew heavier. "Don't," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Don't call them." Jake froze, his phone halfway to his ear. None of us moved. The air felt charged, heavy with tension, like the moment before a storm breaks. The man took a shaky step forward, and my heart leapt into my throat. Then, out of nowhere, he shouted a single word that broke the spell. "Forget it," he barked, his voice filled with frustration. And then he ran. He bolted down the alley, his feet slapping against the pavement, the knife still sticking out of his gut. I don't know how he managed to run in his condition, maybe adrenaline, maybe something else, but he disappeared into the darkness before any of us could process what had just happened. We stood there in stunned silence, the weight of what we'd witnessed pressing down on us like a physical force. My hands were shaking, and my mouth felt dry. Jake was the first to speak. What was that?" None of us had an answer. We stayed in the alley long enough to explain everything to the police when they arrived, but by then, the man was long gone. They asked us a million questions, what he looked like, what he said, which direction he went, but all we could do was repeat the same story, over and over. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, and though they didn't say it outright, I could tell they were just as disturbed as we were. We never found out who he was or what had happened to him. Did he survive? Was he running from someone, or something? And why was he so desperate to avoid the police? Even now, years later, the memory of that night sends chills down my spine. I can still see his blood-streaked shirt, his unblinking eyes, the strange way he stood up as though the knife in his stomach didn't matter. It was a quiet night in Philly. My mom and I were home, just the two of us. She was upstairs folding laundry, and I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone. The glow of the screen was the only light in the room, and everything felt calm, almost peaceful. Then came the noise. It was faint at first, like a soft scraping against the front door. I paused, ears straining, my heart quickening. Philly isn't exactly the safest city, but our neighborhood was usually uneventful. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself, or a stray cat. But the noise came again, louder this time, more deliberate. Someone was trying to get in. I crept toward the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. Next to the door, there was a narrow window, just big enough to peek through. The curtains were drawn, but I slid them aside just a fraction, enough to see what was happening on the other side. What I saw made my stomach drop. Two men in ski masks stood on the porch. One of them was holding a long metal pipe or some kind of tool, and the other had a gun that was now pointed directly at the window, at me. For a split second, we locked eyes through the glass. Even though I couldn't see their faces, I could feel their intensity, their cold, calculated focus. My breath caught in my throat. The man with the gun raised it slightly, as if to warn me, and my body moved on pure instinct. I bolted away from the door, my legs carrying me down the hall as fast as they could. My mom's voice called out from upstairs, alarmed by the noise. "Stay up there!" I yelled back, my voice trembling. "Call 911. I didn't stop until I reached the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to lock it. Then I remembered my dad's shotgun. The 10 gauge was kept in a closet near the bathroom, unloaded but ready if we ever needed it. My dad had shown me how to use it a couple of times, and even though I wasn't comfortable with guns, I was thankful he'd taken the time to teach me. I grabbed the gun, fumbling with the shells as I loaded it. My breaths came in short, panicked gasps, but I forced myself to focus. With the shotgun in my hands, I stood in the bathroom doorway, every muscle in my body coiled like a spring. The house felt eerily silent. I could hear my own heartbeat, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, but nothing else. Were they still outside? Were they inside now, creeping through the shadows? I didn't know, and that was the worst part, not knowing where they were or what they might do next. I pressed my back against the wall and dialed 911 with my free hand. The dispatcher's voice was calm, steady, and exactly what I needed in that moment. 911, what's your emergency? 2 men are trying to break into my house, I whispered, my voice shaking. One of them has a gun. Are you in a safe place? She asked. I'm in the hallway with a shotgun, I said. Please send help. They're still outside, I think. Officers are on their way. Stay where you are and keep the line open. The dispatcher's voice was reassuring, but it didn't stop the fear coursing through me. Every second felt like an eternity as I stood there, waiting, listening for any sound that might betray their movements. My grip on the shotgun tightened. Then I heard it, the sound of running footsteps outside, fading into the distance. A moment later, the wail of approaching sirens cut through the night. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't move from my spot. Not yet. It wasn't long before the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street outside. I heard the officers shouting, barking commands at someone. When the dispatcher told me it was safe to come out, I finally lowered the shotgun and opened the front door. My legs felt like jelly as I stepped onto the porch. The 2 men had been caught just a few streets away. They were handcuffed, their ski masks removed, their faces hard and expressionless. The officers told me they'd found the gun and the pipe on them, along with tools used for breaking into homes. It wasn't until later that I learned who these men really were. They weren't just petty thieves or first-time criminals. Both of them had multiple warrants across several states, Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. They'd broken into homes before, and in one case, they'd left a father of two paralyzed after shooting him in the spine. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. If they'd gotten inside, if I hadn't seen them through the window, what might have happened to me? To my mom? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with my mom, the shotgun still within reach, and replayed the events over and over in my mind. The image of the man with the gun staring at me through the glass was burned into my memory, a haunting reminder of how close I'd come to danger. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I'm thankful that I wasn't hurt, that my mom was safe, that the police got there in time. But the fear lingers, a quiet hum in the back of my mind, reminding me how quickly things can go wrong. I've moved out since then, but I'm more cautious than I used to be. I double-check the locks every night, keep my curtains drawn, and pay attention to every sound in the house. It might seem paranoid to some, but after staring into the barrel of a gun, you don't take chances anymore. That night taught me something important. Fear can keep you alive. It sharpens your instincts, forces you to act when it matters most. And sometimes, it's the only thing standing between you and the worst day of your life. I had gone to the local grocery store in Vermont to pick up a few things, a routine errand that I'd done countless times before. The kind of day where nothing seemed out of place, cloudy skies, the crisp air of late autumn, and the faint smell of damp leaves clinging to the air. It was 1999, and the world felt simpler back then. I had no idea that this day would become one of the darkest memories of my life. As I walked out of the store, I saw them. A young couple, maybe in their late 20s, stood near the edge of the parking lot. The man was tall, with a muscular build, wearing a worn denim jacket. The woman, smaller and frail-looking, held a baby in her arms while a toddler clung to her leg. They were arguing, loudly. Their voices carried through the parking lot, sharp and heated. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was intense enough to catch the attention of a few passers-by. For a brief moment, I thought about stepping in, or at least making sure everything was okay. But I stopped myself. It wasn't my business, and they didn't seem to notice anyone else around them. I kept walking. As I loaded my groceries into the car, I glanced over at them again. The woman had started walking away, her movements hurried and desperate. The toddler stumbled to keep up, and the baby squirmed in her arms. The man followed a few steps behind, his fists clenched at his sides. The arguing had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I tried to shake it off. It wasn't my problem, I told myself. Couples argue all the time. I slid into the driver's seat, started the car, and began to pull out of the parking lot. Then I heard it. The sound was unmistakable, sharp, violent, and piercing. A gunshot. My heart froze as the first shot echoed through the air, followed by another and another. I slammed on the brakes, my pulse pounding in my ears. Time seemed to slow as I glanced into my rearview mirror. What I saw will haunt me forever. The man stood there, his arm outstretched, a gun in his hand. The woman had fallen to the ground, the baby lying motionless beside her. The toddler, barely old enough to understand what was happening, stood frozen a few feet away. My stomach twisted as the man turned the gun toward the child. Another shot. I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, to do something, anything, but my body felt paralyzed. Then, as if in slow motion, the man raised the gun to his own head. For a split second, our eyes met in the mirror. His face was blank, emotionless. And then he pulled the trigger. The sound of the final gunshot shattered the air. He collapsed to the ground, the gun slipping from his hand. The entire family lay still in the parking lot, a scene of unspeakable horror etched against the gray sky. I sat there, frozen in disbelief. The world around me seemed to vanish. The faint hum of my car engine, the rustling of the wind, the distant sound of other shoppers, it all faded into nothingness. My mind struggled to process what I had just seen. Finally, my body caught up with my brain. My hands fumbled for my phone as I dialed 911, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely hit the right buttons. When the dispatcher answered, my voice came out in a shaky whisper. "There's been a shooting," I stammered, my words tumbling over each other. "A man, he shot his family. He shot himself. I'm at the grocery store on Main Street. Please send someone. The dispatcher's calm voice was a stark contrast to the panic surging through me. She told me to stay on the line and wait for the police. But staying put meant staying near the nightmare unfolding behind me, and every instinct screamed at me to drive away, to get as far from the horror as possible. I forced myself to stay, watching the scene in the mirror as if keeping my eyes on it would somehow make it less real. But it didn't. The image burned itself into my mind, the lifeless bodies, the blood pooling on the pavement, the way the man's final moments had played out like a horrifying movie. Within minutes, the parking lot was swarmed with flashing lights and sirens. Police cars and ambulances arrived, officers shouting orders as they secured the area. One of them approached my car, his face grim. He asked if I had seen what happened. My voice shook as I recounted everything. The argument, the gunshots, the way the man had turned the gun on himself. The officer listened, his jaw tight, and thanked me before walking back to the scene. I stayed there for what felt like hours, answering questions, replaying the events over and over in my head. When they finally let me leave, my legs felt like lead as I got back into the car. Driving home, I couldn't stop shaking. The silence in the car was deafening, filled only with the haunting echoes of gunshots that refused to leave my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, the couple, the children, the man's blank expression as he raised the gun. The scene replayed over and over, like a broken record I couldn't turn off. I later learned more about the family through the news. The man had a history of violence and had recently lost his job. The woman had been trying to leave him, to protect herself and the children, but it wasn't enough. The headlines were cold and factual, reducing the tragedy to a few sentences. Family killed in murder-suicide outside local grocery store. But for me, it was so much more than a headline. It was a memory that refused to fade, a nightmare that followed me long after the police tape was taken down. Even now, years later, I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, hearing those gunshots in my dreams. I can't step into a grocery store parking lot without feeling that familiar knot of dread tightening in my chest. My colleague Rachel had come in looking pale and distracted, her usual bubbly demeanor replaced with a quiet, uneasy calm. I didn't press her about it at first. Everyone has their off days, but during lunch, she finally sat down and said, "I need to tell you what happened last night." The tone in her voice made me put my fork down. She was serious, and there was something about the way she said it that sent a chill up my spine. Rachel had gone out for a few drinks after work the night before. Nothing wild, just a casual evening with a couple of friends at a local bar. By the time she headed home, it was late but not unreasonably so, probably just after midnight. She caught her usual bus, the one that dropped her off a few blocks from her house. The streets were quiet, as they usually were that time of night, and she started walking the familiar route home. That's when she noticed a taxi pulling up alongside her. It was a black cab, one of those trustworthy city-standard vehicles, but she still felt wary. The driver rolled down the window and leaned toward her. "Miss," he said, his voice urgent but calm. "Get in the car." Rachel stopped walking and looked at him, confused. "No, thank you," she said, continuing on her way. But the cab didn't drive off. It followed her slowly, the tires crunching softly on the pavement. The driver called out again, his tone more desperate this time. "Please, just get in the car. You can call anyone you want while you're inside. Your family, the police, anyone. Just get in, and I'll explain." Rachel hesitated. Every instinct told her not to trust strangers, especially at night, and especially when they were so persistent. But there was something in his voice, a genuine urgency that made her stop. The way he wasn't demanding, but pleading. Against her better judgment, she opened the door and got in. The moment she was inside, the driver locked the doors and sped off down the street. Rachel's heart was pounding, and she clutched her phone, ready to dial 911 if she needed to. She turned to the driver, ready to demand answers. Before she could speak, he pointed to the side mirror. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quickly. "I'm here to help." Rachel glanced at the mirror, and her stomach dropped. Walking down the street, not far from where she had been just moments ago, was a man. He was shirtless, barefoot, and clutching a machete in one hand. His steps were slow and deliberate, his body silhouetted against the dim glow of the streetlights. "He's been pacing the area for a while," the driver explained. "I called the police, but when I saw you walking toward him, I knew I couldn't just drive off and leave you there." Rachel couldn't breathe. She stared out the back window as the figure grew smaller and smaller in the distance. The man hadn't even looked in their direction. He was focused on something, or someone else. She realized how close she'd been to crossing paths with him, how easily she could have walked right into his path without even knowing. The driver continued to talk, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. I don't know what his deal is, but I wasn't going to take any chances. You shouldn't have been out there alone. Rachel was shaking now, the adrenaline making her feel lightheaded. Thank you, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The cab driver nodded, his eyes still focused on the road. No need to thank me. Just stay safe. He drove her all the way to her house, refusing to take any money for the ride. By the time she got out, the flashing lights of a police car were visible in the distance, heading toward the area where the man with the machete had been. Rachel never found out what happened after that, whether the police found him, or whether he disappeared into the night. She didn't want to know. All she could think about was how close she had come to something terrible. By the time she finished telling me the story, Rachel was trembling slightly, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if for warmth. I didn't know what to say. The thought of her walking alone, oblivious to the danger just a few steps ahead, made my skin crawl. The fact that a complete stranger had stopped to help her, putting himself at risk in the process, was both incredible and deeply unsettling. What if he hadn't been there? I asked quietly, more to myself than to her. Rachel shook her head, her eyes distant. I don't know, she said. I don't want to know. That night, as I walked home, Rachel's story played over and over in my mind. The image of the man with the machete haunted me, his slow, deliberate walk, the weapon glinting faintly under the streetlights. It was the kind of thing you'd see in a horror movie, not something that actually happened. But it had happened, and the scariest part, it could have happened to anyone. I started to notice every shadow, every figure in the distance. The rustle of leaves, the sound of footsteps echoing off the pavement, everything felt amplified, like the world had become a little darker, a little more dangerous. When I finally got home, I double-checked the locks on my door, something I hadn't done in years. Rachel's story changed the way I saw the world. It made me realize how quickly the ordinary can turn into something terrifying, how thin the line is between safety and danger. It also reminded me that there are still good people out there, people like the cab driver who went out of his way to protect a stranger. But most of all, it left me with a deep, gnawing unease. Because for every cab driver willing to step in, there are countless others who wouldn't. And for every close call, there are stories that don't end with a ride home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Rachel, about the machete, about how fragile safety really is. It's a story I'll never forget, no matter how many years pass. It's a reminder of how close danger can be, even when you think you're safe.